Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream, where we cover the pressing issues of the day. We've been doing that for over a year now. You, our audience members, make this possible. Thanks so much for joining us each week. And you know that typically what we cover is a precise public policy issue facing the states or facing Congress or facing the world. Sometimes, as we will do today, we'll take a step back from specific policy issues, or at least a single specific policy issue, and instead focus on an idea. And today we're focusing on an idea that's important to the country, to the world, even if you're watching and you wouldn't describe yourself as a quote unquote conservative. Today's topic, the future of conservatism, will have an outsized effect on the future of America and the future of the world. And I'll introduce our guests shortly, but suffice it to say that today's conversation will be riveting. And if this is a question you've been asking yourself, especially since the outcome of the November 2020 election, you're in store for a terrific conversation. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation and your host. I am privileged to be joined by two friends, Dr. Matthew Peterson, founding editor of The American Mind, and Saurabh Sharma, who's president of the new organization American Moment. If you're in the audience and you're unaware yet of Matt Peterson or Saurabh Sharma, you are going to enjoy what they have to say today, and you'll enjoy following what they write, what they comment on in the news, not just about our topic today, the future of conservatism, but about American politics generally. So let me say one more thing before we get into the first comments from our guests. Let's say you tuned in today and you were looking forward to maybe some red meat commentary about what's going on with corporate wokeness. Those of us who are baseball fans, certainly I am, woke up this morning irritated about Major League Baseball's decision to move the All-Star game from Atlanta, Georgia. And maybe if you're like me, you were fully expecting our elected officials in red states to give in. How terrific it is, for the first time in my memory, that our governors are pushing back on this corporate wokeness. We'll talk about that in more specificity, but it is exactly that kind of issue that is relevant to the topic we're going to be covering today. So stay tuned. You'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. If you already have questions, you know how to do that. Enter them into the comment section of whatever social media channel you're using. Well, gentlemen, let me get to you because you're the real stars of this show. Matt Peterson, Saurabh Sharma, thanks for joining us. Saurabh, I'm going to turn to you first for the proverbial 30,000-foot view question, which is, what is the state of conservatism today in the United States?
Sure, and thank you for having me, Kevin. I've done a lot of stuff with TPPF over the years, so I'm excited to be doing this live stream. I think the future of conservatism is unknown. I think we're at a fork in the road. After President Trump lost the 2020 election, I think there's a lot of incumbent forces in the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and elsewhere that are very eager to return to a pre-Trump consensus of, what I've, largely defined as, loose borders, corporate solicitude, and weakness in the face of cultural decline. And then there are those of us who see a different path forward, where the conservative movement can be the champion of the great middle of this country, of genuinely working class interests, and standing as a serious counter to the forces of cultural decline that are on the march in this country. And what that means is not just a postural change. It doesn't mean slightly tweaking our rhetoric and saying the word working class a few extra times in speeches. It also means thinking critically about some of the orthodoxies that have dominated a lot of the conservative movement over the last 40 years, orthodoxies that existed for good reason because they were very helpful to addressing the challenges of the times in which they were envisioned. When inflation and stagnation are the primary economic crises facing the country, some of the economic policies that we've championed for the last 40 years make sense. There's different ones that face the country now. And the way that I think about conservatism, the way that I think a responsible right should approach all policy questions is, what are the things that we're looking to protect in society and in civilization? To me, that's family. To me, that's, some level of public order, national cohesion, and the ability to be independent and sovereign as a nation. Those things are under threat from all sides. And so my vision of the future of conservatism meets those challenges head on in new and interesting ways.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. You've got listed a lot there that we'll unpack, at least some of, in today's episode, but really you are helping to define the agenda for those of us working on the future of conservatism. Matt Peterson, you've played a role in that regard for a long time, even though you're still a relatively young guy. And so I want to ask you the same question. What's your assessment of where conservatism is right now, if you want to use the metaphor, in its life cycle? I love the metaphor that Saurabh uses about being at a fork in the road. It certainly feels that way.
Well, first, Kevin, thank you for having me on and calling me relatively young. I'm going to put that in my Twitter bio and remind my wife of it daily. So it's a really important question. And I think that what I don't like about the situation right now is we're living in a bifurcated timeline. So on the one hand, you kind of have, oh, this is what conservatism was. This is conservatism. I'm putting on my conservative hat. On the other side, you have people in their real lives who are looking around going, I mean, I almost want to use expletives. They're looking around going, this is a very serious situation. And I don't see anyone stepping up to the plate, or we really have to fight harder. Right? We need to find some way to counter what's going on across this country. And that disconnect is a real problem. And so you kind of had a lot of people going on autopilot for a while. And then Trump came in and shook everything up, right? And so now you see in response a lot of debate, a lot of healthy debate, I think, on the right about how to move forward. And if I was to categorize what the fork in the road is, I mean, it's sort of do the same thing or abide by the same quote unquote principles. Some of them are principles that shouldn't change. Some of them are just prudential policy preferences from the past that need to change. Or do we change in some way to address the landscape? And most of the change we're talking about is really just addressing the actual landscape of reality that we now face. And that means being far bolder than we were in the past. So the example you brought up at the beginning was a great one. I think a lot of people who identify as conservatives would say, in response to woke capital, large corporations that have politicized their entire outfit and that are now inserting themselves into state politics. I mean, the state of Georgia is considering an issue that's very important for the preservation of democracy, election security. And you have large corporations coming in and on behalf of the Democratic Party or the powers that be, changing their opinion, right, within a few days because the president says so, and ordering the state to do this or otherwise we're going to punish you in some way. Well, that's a new circumstance. In the past, we might have said, well, government shouldn't be attacking corporations. But if corporations are going to do that, then there needs to be a response. They're attacking you. They're attacking state sovereignty, right? So I think, I think there's a lot of, in the intellectual world, there's a lot of, conservatives love to argue about isms and istics and theory. But I think in reality, most Republicans understand that the moment, this American moment, to use Mr. Sharma's phrase, demands a much bolder response than autopilot.
Yeah, well said. Well, Saurabh, you've been cued very well by Matt about the American moment. We want to get into what your organization is doing, but let's stick with this thread about fighting back against woke capitalism, just to frame this a little bit before what I know you to have is eloquent commentary on this. I was so thrilled that just before we came on the air, our governor, Greg Abbott in Texas, he announced that he's refusing to throw out the first pitch of the Texas Rangers game today or tomorrow because American Airlines, or because of Major League Baseball, we'll get to American Airlines in a minute, because of Major League Baseball's decision to move the All-Star game. And what he's rejecting is their false narrative. Praise God, we have a governor in a red state talking about the problem, which is the left's belief that they can always have a monopoly on the narrative. And on this one, they're 100% wrong. We'll get into the election reform bills specifically in a moment. But before we do so, Saurabh, just explain to us why woke capitalism really is sort of this whole problem, this fork in the road for conservatism in microcosm.
It's a huge problem, Kevin. And in some ways, it is a symptom and the ultimate consequence of conservatism's broader failures over the last 30 to 40 years. We thought for a long time that some of the craziness that we saw on college campuses was going to eventually go away. oh, once these kids with their underwater basket weaving, feminist degrees end up graduating, they're going to have to go into the real world and they're going to eventually wise up. That's not what happened. They bent institutions to their will because the moral imperialistic framework of, we are on the right side of history and we are the vanguard of the good and the just will always beat out the leave me alone mentality. And the leave me alone mentality has traditionally been the posture that the right adopts. And so these, this mindset, this far left mindset, whether it's around things like gender identity politics or racial politics, has infected our biggest corporations. And now all of the capital that they control has been weaponized against the right, which has traditionally seen itself as the party of business. When, in my mind, the American conservative movement sees itself as the engine of prosperity. Eventually that was boiled down to something a lot simpler and I think a lot more incorrect, which is just we're pro-business. And so the consequence has been that we cow when faced with corporations that are threatening to pull a rug out from under us, whether it's tangible financial support to candidates and PACs, or more broadly, just the kind of moral imprimatur of being for business and jobs, as these companies tend to paint themselves as being for. It's been instilled in me from the very first job I had in politics that this is a problem. And the reason why is because I worked in the Texas Capitol during the 85th legislative session in 2017, when we had the Women's Privacy Act up for a vote that session. The Women's Privacy Act, for those of you who don't remember, was in response to municipal ordinances that were passed in Texas that essentially said that businesses are not allowed to decide whether or not to have gender neutral restrooms, that they must have gender neutral restrooms. And all the Texas legislature wanted to do was to preempt these municipalities and say, no, a private business is able to decide. And also in public facilities, we're going to recognize that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. That received such overwhelming censure from corporations that eventually that bill fizzled out in the reddest of red Texas right after President Trump was elected, and the bill was not refiled the next session. So it's been a part of my experience in politics since the very beginning that this is an issue, and it's not one that's going to go away unless the right is willing to recognize that A, corporate America is fully captured by the left, and a lot of other American institutions are, and B, that responding to them will mean hitting them where it hurts, which in many cases is the various benefits we give these the largest American corporations in law.
Yeah, it's true. And the precise issue on my mind, Texas specific, in addition to Governor Abbott's decision regarding Major League Baseball's fallacy, is American Airlines last Thursday, based in Dallas, one of the largest airlines in the world, heck, they could be the largest airline in the world, announcing that because of the bill that our state Senate passed on election reform, including the very controversial idea that you have to show a voter ID in order to vote, they were going to be boycotting Texas. And later that night, when our Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick talked to American Airlines government affairs person, and this is so typical of the left, and he asked that person point blank, have you read the bill? Credit to American Airlines government affairs person for being honest in that moment when they said no. And that's the whole point, that there is such arrogance by the left and their corporate woke allies that they can cause us to cower in fear. And honestly, guys, the record of conservative elected officials is pretty bad on this point. Usually they do cower in fear, but it seems as if we've turned the corner. And perhaps to the points that both of you have made already, we're turning the corner because there's a recognition among conservatives as we walk through this path of the next generation of our movement that we have to stand up to these folks. We could spend an entire hour talking about just that, and perhaps we will at some point in the future, but I want to cover as many issues as we can in the time that we have allotted. And I want to ask you two questions before we turn to audience questions. The first is, what are the issues on which there would be broad agreement across the conservative movement as we navigate this fork in the road? And then once we cover those, I know there are some issues on which there is not broad agreement. And as I think the two of you do, and I certainly like to do, we want to put those elephants in the room as they were right here in center and discuss them. So let's start with issues of agreement, issues where you think the conservative movement might quickly recohere if we're able to gravitate toward these issues. Matt, we'll go to you first.
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot. The reason you see governors standing up is because I think governors understand where the base is at. I mean, they're just closer to the people than the sad group of people that's in DC. So, when you see Abbott, DeSantis, and all these governors standing up, I mean, they understand where the base is at. And there is broad agreement among Republicans that much bolder action is needed because they sense the moment. They see how bad things are. So let me give an example of a place where people talk about, well, the new right, I'm not sure where they are in the economy and whether I can agree with them. They seem to be just want to use government power for good. And that bothers me because we want limited government. And so you'll see some people saying, you can't strike back against these corporations. That's the problem. Well, I think that's asinine because all libertarians agree that special breaks, right, special discounts for certain corporations and not others, creates an uneven playing field. And as far as I'm concerned, that was never a part of the conservative movement. It was okay, right, to not have an equal playing field and to allow not only regulation but special breaks to favor certain corporations over others. That was always a libertarian principle, and so there should be no problem with threatening to remove those breaks that shouldn't be there in the first place, according to libertarian dogma, in response to business sticking its neck into politics for the sake of sheer power plays for the left. So I think there's some agreement there. I also think that the moment demands a lot of for-profits that we need. I mean, we need new technology companies. I mean, I think build your own Google is ultimately a kind of a dumb phrase. I mean, build your own Google. So find a couple of people who went to Stanford and got government grants from DARPA to create a monopolistic empire. I don't know how I'm going to do that. But I do think that there's a lot of agreement that some entrepreneurship that's thinking about serving red state America or creating an alternate internet that's outside the control of these large technology corporations. I mean, everyone can agree on that. And that's something where that needs to be done. It needs to be done in a very serious way. And the big thing that I think there's a lot of agreement on, although it makes people who are too close to DC uncomfortable, is election integrity. Look, it doesn't matter what you think about the election. I always thought, no Republican should be sitting there afraid to talk about election integrity. This was always the position of the Republican Party, that there was an enormous problem in many of these states with our laws when it comes to elections, that voter ID is common sense. So many other countries have it, and that we know games are played this way. So that's been for years, right? That's been something I thought the right was for. And so I think there's a broad agreement on that as well.
Yeah, and in fact, broad agreement on one provision of election reform, which is voter identification in order to vote, including for mail-in ballots. 56% of Democrats agree with that now. So it's just preposterous that, not that we necessarily need to govern according to public opinion polls, but it's just telling about how broad agreement is among all Americans, including those left of center on that issue. Saurabh, before we turn to the issue I think you really want to talk about, which is that set of questions that might be uncomfortable in this conversation about conservatism, what are some additional issues on which you do know that there's broad agreement?
Sure. I want to make a distinction when we're talking about the conservative movement, because I think talking about the base of the conservative movement, the ordinary people that vote and walk and, contribute small dollars, they are, I think, fairly united on these questions. Really, when we're talking about where the issues are, we're talking about elites, for lack of a better term, the people who are in public policy organizations, who are in Congress, who are in positions of influence that for a variety of reasons still have some sticking points when it comes to these questions. Look, I think that one thing that we can all agree on is courage is needed. Put aside any internecine or ideological differences, courage and follow through are the most important thing in this moment. And, I was really excited when I saw that Georgia was going to consider getting rid of a tax break for Delta after that statement that came out from Delta Airlines. And in fact, the repeal of that tax break passed the House. And I was tweeting excitedly about it. And then just yesterday, I decided to go look and see, what exactly happened? Well, it turns out the Senate decided not to repeal that tax break. And so it remains intact. And so the credibility of the threat from the right to these woke corporations is left fairly meager. That they don't actually think that we have the attention span or the follow through to actually go through to the end, and that their lobbyists and their allies will eventually follow through for them. So I think that at a broad level, put aside any of the particular, intellectual disagreements, there is a shortage of courage. We need more of it, and conservatives have always known that. I mean, that's a lot of what the Tea Party came up. That's what to do. That's what the Freedom Caucus, both nationally and in Texas, was for. We need more of that. Beyond those issues, I think that there's two that are fairly robust on the right. I think election integrity is certainly one of them. We have to have the ability to vote out people in power, and the nexus between corporate America and the election issue is much thinner than I think even Matt made it out to be. There's pretty compelling evidence that it was a coalition of foundations and the Democratic Party and woke corporations that had a lot to do with what happened with the 2020 election, whether that's more high level stuff like when it came to narrative shaping, or very practical things like how search engines worked around the elections, whether or not you were allowed to post articles that were inconvenient to the narrative that Joe Biden had, and so on. And so preventing direct corporate control of our elections is something that I think people are fairly united on and are going to do their best to make sure never happens again. Beyond that, I think that more broadly, the issue of big tech is one that I think conservatives have finally woken up on. And so where I think the disagreement ends up coming there is to what extent should we be talking about it? I find that a lot of the people who've recently kind of woken up to these concerns are proposing the solutions that may have been appropriate 3 years ago, when perhaps we need to be thinking even more aggressively than that because of how far along these concerns have gotten. But I think there's a pretty robust consensus now that the power that these technology conglomerates have is just untenable in a republic, and in the vision of American society that I think a lot of conservative voters and people in general have.
Yeah, I agree entirely on not just your point about big tech, but we're conservative by nature, so we're tending to react to the most recent battle, or in some cases in the history of our movement, a few battles prior to that. It's really important that folks like the two of you and others who are very, very intentionally asking and trying to answer this question, what's the future of conservatism, think about not just the next election cycle, but far more important than election cycles, the arena of ideas, the arena of economics, where transactions are happening. We'll come back to that in a future episode, but I really do want to talk about some disagreements. I'll come to you, Saurabh, first on this. There's a big menu there of issues that are controversial today for conservatives, libertarians, all center-right folks, because they've been controversial for the most part for a long time. And to the extent that conservative candidates succeed on a national stage, and that isn't an election, they do so by their own ability, rhetorically and otherwise, to cohere this pretty disparate group of, for the most part, like-minded folks. But in the absence of that leadership, the history of the Republic shows that the movement really is rather fractured, which I feel today. Some of these issues might be trade, immigration, especially what we do with a legal immigration system, foreign policy generally, but in particular China. Just want to cover those as well as any other points of disagreement that y'all see before turning to audience questions. So Saurabh, will turn to you first on disagreements.
Sure. I think that the way that I think about these issues is pretty simple. Who are our voters, and how do we defend their interests in a robust and forthright way? It's a very classical vision of politics in that sense. And so what are the threats facing ordinary working class, conservatives across the country? They're the threats that face a lot of people. It's things like job security. It's things like their ability to have families, and it's the cultural threats that we face. And so, whereas traditionally the threats to those things were things like high taxes on middle class families, or a stifling regulation that prevented the free flow of commerce, today I think they're a little bit different. What we did with our trade regime over the last 40 years, I think, is nothing short of like political malpractice, where we essentially, cleaned our hands of the idea that there's any public policy to be had on trade and said, the freer, the better. What was the result of that? Well-paying blue collar jobs in the industrial Midwest and across the country were sent away to China and the rest of the Far East. Was that a good choice? Was that a choice that we should have done? Well, it brought down the price of consumer goods. But I mean, I think anyone with children, and I don't have any, but I know a lot of them, would recognize that it's not necessarily a good thing that your, kid is addicted to a cheap iPad that you were able to buy, or that, education is improved just because we have 50,000 laptops in our schools or things like that. So, cheaper goods don't necessarily equal broad-based prosperity. And so thinking about whether it's better that a TV is $100 cheaper than it was 50 years ago, or whether it's a problem that a hardworking family of 5 in Ohio is no longer able to make a living because their factory closed down, is, I think, something we have to think about critically. It also has implications for our national security. If you're not able to make things in your country, and if there ever is broad geopolitical conflict in the world, you're in for real trouble. And we faced that in some ways during coronavirus, where every nation was justifiably looking out for themselves and their people, and we weren't able to manufacture critical medicines and protective equipment in the way that we needed to. That can be extrapolated out to our broader economy. Should we be able to manufacture semiconductors in our country for our electronics to make sure that we're not, getting spied on at all times? Should we be able to have some level of domestic steel and car manufacturing? Should we be able to make things in America? I think we should. And that's a mindset that I think, again, I'd make the distinction between conservative voters and conservative elites. I think it's one that to ordinary people makes a lot of sense. Of course, we should be able to make things. I'd love to buy things in America if I could, but it's one that I think there's a lot of hangups on at the broad level. I think a very similar approach needs to be had for immigration. It's broadly accepted that we need to have border security on the right. Put aside the real issue of breaking a nation's laws in order to enter it illegally. What are the consequences beyond that we justifiably respond to when it comes to the question of illegal immigration? We recognize that cheap labor undercuts American workers. That applies to legal immigration as well, whether it's at the low skill level, the constellation of things like farm visas and other things we have in our country, or at the high level with the H-1B visa system that really, we tell American college graduates that they should learn to code, and then there's no coding jobs available because there's this constellation of consultancy organizations that are able to import laborers from India to do that work instead. So trade and immigration, I think, are two critical issues that go to this more, national interest-oriented mindset on policy that I think conservatives need to have. But I'll let Matt jump in here. But those are, I think, two that there's still some disagreement on, but that I think the path forward is really clear if we're serious about defending the interests of conservative voters.
Yeah, thanks, Saurabh. Matt, what would you say to that question about issues of disagreement facing the movement?
Well, I mean, I think first off, the general tenor goes, the difference is this, I think. First, the first fork on the road is, do you understand the seriousness of the new threats against kind of American civilization? Do you understand the seriousness of the moment? Do you see that, for instance, critical race theory isn't just some argument about political correctness? It's whether you're going to have people who consider themselves citizens of the same country that you recognize or think you recognize in your head, right? I mean, are you going to have people who understand civics at all? Are you going to have people who agree with the principle of declaration that a fundamental human equality is at the bottom of our notion of government? Or are you going to have a racialized caste system that's going to set up a bunch of identities, over each other in this constant changing equation? And I mean, when it comes to, immigration, do you realize, right, what has happened and why people are upset and why the base has been upset about immigration for 20, 30 years, and so many people in charge just don't seem to care even today. So there's a kind of a threat level, right? If you recognize the threat, then you're going to want to take a much bolder action. In terms of principled debates, I would say I think a lot of it centers around our notion of the free market and of the power of government and how government should exercise its power. There really was a legitimate sense that because of the rise of the administrative state over the last 100 years and the rise of a kind of liberalism that seemed to not so much care about the Constitution and limits on government, that the response to that was, look, we're anti-government, right? And I don't think we're anti-government. I think we want good rule. We want good government, which in many cases means limiting its power. And are we, free market, right? It's the same way. Of course, free market, but also I recognize that markets are created by structures that are shaped by law, right? And that's just the way it is. So we can pretend that that's not the case. I guess, so to boil it down, it's when you look at free market and limited government as principles, right? What does that mean? I think that's what the debate is really about on so many of these issues. What does that mean? And as a principle, does this mean you can do nothing about immigration? Does this mean you can do nothing about technology companies? And I think that's where the disagreement lies.
And on top of that, I mean, it's, the way I think about free market and limited government is the reason that voters have supported those principles for so long, and why a lot of conservative leaders have, is because we recognize that in most cases they help families flourish, they restrain tyranny, they ensure the general welfare, as the preamble of the Constitution says so. And so the real question is, are they doing that now, or are the threats to those things coming from places where we didn't expect, like big corporations? And so does it mean adjusting our perspective on one to meet this new challenge that we're facing now?
Man, there's a lot there, Matt and Saurabh. I want to keep asking follow-up questions, but it's now time for our audience members to do so. I know that they've enjoyed the conversation because we have several questions in the queue. We'll do our best to get through them, or as many of them as possible, expeditiously. So first question from the audience member, something we haven't talked about, which has been really important in the last 15 months, and that's the COVID pandemic and the related shutdowns. This audience member asks, what's the single biggest thing they mean the conservative movement, have learned from that experience with the pandemic and the shutdowns? What's our biggest opportunity, therefore, to influence policy in those regards? Saurabh, you want to start?
Sure. When I think about what I've learned from the COVID pandemic, and this goes above and beyond some of my, ideological priors about, things about trade and immigration and stuff that I've already, talked about, is that it's very clear that our expert class in the United States and in the West writ large is utterly, morally, and substantively bankrupt. That they are not, that they are imposters and that they are frauds. They have not earned the power that they have accrued to themselves, and they need to be treated as clowns and jokers, really. And that includes, the avatars of that like Anthony Fauci that we can think of, but it also includes the constellation of institutions in American life that we look to for expertise, whether it's the most prestigious medical journals, the fanciest schools, newspapers, and so on, that they chose to pursue a partisan and ideological agenda during a pandemic that demanded actual and legitimate expertise. And because of that, countless Americans suffered. There is no better example of this than the Wuhan lab hypothesis, where you were called a crackpot and a conspiracy theorist all throughout 2020 if you believed that there was a good chance that this emerged from a research laboratory in Wuhan. Now, because they got Joe Biden into the White House, they can finally peep under the hood and decide if this is a real thing or not. And now the New Yorker is publishing, 10,000 word features on how it might be true. You should not own a mask to you must triple mask. The vaccine is the key to all of our woes, but, don't expect to go out this summer. It's very clear that we are under a capricious and an immoral rule in this country by experts that once upon a time actually had genuine credibility and expertise, but have chosen to whittle that away in service of political narratives. And that's why, you're not allowed to see your grandmother, but a Black Lives Matter rally that burns down an American city is totally fine.
Yeah. Matt, anything to add?
Well, first, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think the single biggest cultural thing that's happened is complete undermining of expert class. The right should take full advantage of that. We should all be emboldened by what's happened. It's been a master class in the failure of the left's control of these institutions. I'd add two things. One is there's an enormous opportunity in education right now. Parents of all stripes who don't even care about politics are now in a situation in which their faith in the public school system has been undermined. What the unions are doing is absolutely horrific. And that's something that the right in a systematic way could start broad-based movements across this country, bringing in more people, new people towards the right, leaning right. And that's just wide open opportunity. I know many are working on that. I would also say that what this has done in regard to remote work is it's shaken up the country so that everyone's free to move about the cabin. And so I also think there's a challenge here, and there's a lot of opportunity for red states to think about, how do they attract the sort of residents that they want, and that will abide by their kind of values, right? And also not turn their state blue, right? In the case of the state that I'm sitting in right now with you. So I think there's a lot of thought that should be given to how do we reform communities in an age of remote work in a way that works for family and the kind of lifestyles that we think are healthy. And that's a challenge, but it's also an enormous opportunity because people really are looking to pick up, move, and find a way to craft, a way of life that makes sense for them and their family. And that should be regarded as an opportunity by everyone on the right.
Yeah, that's right. That is exactly right. Next question by the audience, important question. We've alluded to this a little bit, and that's the Trump effect. This audience member asks, one thing that divides conservatives is Mr. Trump's behavior. I might say Mr. Trump himself. How can we get never Trumpers and Trump supporters to bury the hatchet? Matt, why don't you take the first stab at that?
Well, I would say certainly among people who are heavily invested in politics, Trump has there's some divisiveness there. But I would say, look, we have to acknowledge first off that the vast majority of the Republican Party and the vast majority of voters were perfectly fine with voting for him. So it's not as if he's divided the Republican voter. They were willing to make that choice and choose him over other candidates, both times. So this is more of a debate among, generally elite people or people who really follow politics. And what I would say is it's never in a way been about Trump. Now that Trump's gone, or at least he's off the stage, the question revolves around the kind of debates that we've been talking about in this last half hour. So I don't know if the hatchet can be buried if Trump leaves and there's still disagreement about what some of these policies should be moving forward. I don't know. Does that make any sense? I mean, in other words, like if you get rid of Trump you get him out of the equation, there still can be a real serious dispute about what the policy should be moving forward. Now, some people who call themselves never Trumpers are now just Democrats. I mean, Mona Sharon voted for Biden. You have, I don't even know what Bill Kristol is at this point. These are people who, to my mind, they're just enemies. I mean, they just attack the right now. That's all they do. And even with Trump gone, they're not content. They call me a fascist every day. It's just part of my life. But so the question is really, where do you come down on these kind of new America First agenda or a Trumpian agenda moving forward? Not so much anymore what you think of Mr. Trump's personal behavior.
Yeah, and I would add before turning to you, Saurabh, quickly, that in the absence of other elected officials who displayed political courage in kind of a Trumpian way, he's going to remain a factor, right? And so I would argue,
oh yes,
that the greatest antidote for someone who's worried about Mr. Trump's behavior, happens not to bother me, but respectfully, or respect those for whom it does, who also support him. I would say the best thing we can do is get other elected officials to have a spine and speak on behalf of real Americans, the way Saurabh put it earlier. And speaking of Saurabh, let me turn to you on this question, because Matt and I are sitting here in Texas, which really is the last great hope for America, but we're doing so because we believe that America remains the best hope for the world. And there you are doing the Lord's work in the nation's swamp every day, dealing with this question. What's your sense of Trump and never Trumpers burying the hatchet?
Sure. So this has been a kind of weird heterodox take of mine for a while, but I actually think that the never Trumper conservative elite never actually had a particular problem with Donald Trump. What their problem was, I mean, and there's actually evidence of this. Bill Kristol posted a picture of a MAGA hat in 2016. But where he really divorced from Donald Trump and was polarized against him was when he came out against the Iraq War. Steve Schmidt tried to get a job with Donald Trump when he was running and eventually was not allowed to. A lot of these people that I now consider, ideological opponents, defenders of this old guard, a morality-free free market or no constraints on corporate power. They were actually talking about a more assertive role for government in the 90s when it was them and their friends that were in government. When their buddies in the administration of George H.W. Bush were the ones making policy, they thought that government had a very important role. And so some of this is just tribalism. It's that, well, me and my friends are no longer in power, and therefore I believe power should not exist. It's fundamentally unprincipled in that sense, and I wish they'd be more honest about it. I think Matt's assessment that this is primarily an internecine elite conflict is accurate, and we should recognize that the bulwark style never Trumper is not a constituency in the electorate more than 0.1%, and it's certainly not what is dispositive in Ohio and Wisconsin and Florida and Arizona. I really believe that. And then the point you made, Kevin, I think is exactly right. And this is something I say even to people that I tend to agree with more on these ideological constraints, is that the reason the base loved President Trump is because they genuinely believed that he would fight for them. And there is no recipe to be had. Even if it adopts all of the ideological positions that I hold, there's no recipe for a successful future candidate or future movement that doesn't center around that fundamental sentiment, the belief that a politician or a movement is actually fighting for the interests of the American people, because they feel themselves under assault by all sides. There's a professor at the University of Texas, Michael Lind, who has this framework for power in American society that it says that there's basically three domains of power. There's cultural power, there's the power of capital in corporations, and then there's political power. The right has lost all of its power in culture and in corporate life. And so all they have as a way to assert themselves as legitimate political actors and societal actors in America is electing leaders who will fight for them. So that has to be the core of any recipe, and there's no getting beyond that, whether or not you liked a particular tweet or not.
Yeah, well said, my friend. Look, guys, we've got time for a couple of additional questions. And Matt, I'll turn to you for this first of the two. And it is just assess for us what you think the future is. And by that, I mean, maybe the next election cycle, 22, the midterms, 24, presidential election, but more important than just the election cycles, which is not to be dismissive of them, about American life. I would describe you, if you don't mind, not only as relatively young, but also one of the great realists I know. In fact, I think I'm correct in remembering that when we met a few months ago that you said you're often very pessimistic. I often ask this question in a different way, which is, tell me why you woke up optimistic about Texas and about America. You can take it that way if you'd like, but I want to invite you, for the sake of being as realistic as you would like, to help our audience members understand what we're up against and, kind of to the point y'all are making, guys, what they can do to be part of the solution.
Yeah, well, I mean, first the pessimism and the optimism. And the pessimism is you have to understand this is a rolling cultural revolution that is having an impact on every part of American life. And so if you do live in a red state, say, you can't be complacent because your schools have these poisonous doctrines being taught just as much as other places. And the corporations in your state are the same as the corporations in other states. So you have this rolling cultural revolution that just keeps on going with the kind of the wokeness and this rejection of the principle of equality. And you have large corporate interests allied with the left in DC now and on down, and they're just pushing to delegitimize the opposition. So the problem we face is that you have a left that's very much ascendant and that is not going to stop coming after your kids, trying to brainwash the rest of the country, and trying to delegitimize any opposition as fascist or terrorists or whatever. and then allow right their own brown shirts in the streets to march and protest whenever needed, and in fact encourage that kind of civil disobedience and law breaking. So this isn't going to stop. Like these kind of ideologues, they don't stop unless there is actual opposition to meet them in some way. So that's sort of what we face. And in the meantime, people, when they speak honestly, gosh, probably in every rural area in the country, they look around and they think this country is going to balkanize in some way. It might split apart if this keeps up, and we have these two completely radically different notions of what human nature is, and whether you can even say someone's a man or a woman or not. And just, as a political philosopher, I have to say, someone who studied this stuff, it's not rocket science. If you have that radically different, understanding of what government is and what human nature is, that can't last forever. That's going to come into conflict, and one or the other side is going to win. So what I would say is hopeful. What we're going to see in the next couple of years is that since the election, there's just been a burst of energy on the right. People, like Mr. Sharma here, are starting new organizations. They're starting new publications. And there are a lot of people, I think, who know what time it is. They're starting new businesses. I mean, I picked up my family and moved to Texas without hesitation. I'm not looking back. I kind of want to build a big, beautiful wall now, but that's another topic for another time. I see a lot of energy on the right to address the landscape that we're in. And I think the good news is that everyone understands red states are the only institution the right still has, right? All the other institutions and the culture are gone, and woke capital has taken over, and people in HR are ruling these corporations, and they're scared. So the only thing we have left are red states, and you're going to see governors and a new cast of red state legislators who are going to stand up and be much more vocal and much bolder. And so I think there's a lot of hope there. And when it comes to what people can do, you have to look for these leaders. You have to look for people like American Moment and like what Sharma's doing. You have to look for people who are willing to speak up, who aren't afraid. That's why Ron DeSantis, right, is so popular. That's why it's so great that Abbott is standing up, right? Because when you see people stand up who aren't afraid of the media and aren't afraid of what the left will call them, I mean, we need to reward those people and rally around them, right? And find those sorts of leaders. And some of you out there need to be that leader and be able to speak out and start leading this movement forward.
No, thanks so much for that comment, Matt. A great segue to you, Saurabh, for the last question, which is similar. Why are you optimistic? But the addendum to the question is, tell us more about what you're trying to accomplish with the American Moment, because you've heard from Matt, and I share his thoughts about it. You deserve a lot of praise for what you've accomplished already. And I really want our audience members, regardless of where they're tuning in from, their age, their background, to understand that there are new, truly young leaders in this movement who I think for the next several decades are going to point us to true north when it comes to conservatism and the future of this country. Tell us about your effort.
Sure. Well, I'll start with why I think there's reason to be optimistic, and it goes to why we're doing what we're doing at American Moment. I think all the pieces are there. We have 76 million voters, probably more. We have, a fairly robust conception of what the threats facing the country are. We have a political system that is still amenable to change. And, it's the greatest country in the world. I love it. And so the question is, what are the barriers to change? And why is it a fork in the road? And why is, destiny not predetermined? And sometimes you get a triumphalism on the right that, all is certain, we will win and we will be victorious. I don't think all is certain, and I don't think all is lost either. I think it is the individual choices of leaders in this moment that will determine what direction the right takes and what direction the country takes. And so what that ends up meaning is that we all have a deep moral responsibility. I was supposed to go to law school this year, and I decided against it because I thought that there was a particular piece of this puzzle, a modest one, that I thought that I maybe alone had the skills in order to solve. And so I felt like I had a moral responsibility in order to stand up, because I knew that we are at a fork in the road. So what is American Moment for? What American Moment is designed to do is to, in part, help incubate the generation of leaders, yes, but also kind of operators that are going to help ensure that this agenda is actually implemented. And implementation is something that we're very big on at American Moment. There's lots of fantastic organizations, think tanks like TPPF that come up with fantastic ideas all day. We have a lot of friends in those institutions, and there's new ones being spun up every day that are really robustly interrogating what needs to be done at a policy level. And then there's, there's candidates and there's PACs and there's C4s and there's organizations doing the fight electorally to get good people elected. But there's a problem that ends up happening. What happens after you elect good people and after you, ask them on the campaign trail if they agree with all these great ideas that are coming out of these institutions? They get to a place like Washington or some other power center in the country, maybe it's Austin, and they proceed to hire all of the people from the swamp, and they proceed to listen to all of the people in the swamp. And the result is that a good person, a driven person, a principled person who's elected to office comes here and is immediately overwhelmed with advice and institutional resources, completely countervailing what they just promised to their voters. That happens in the ranks of congressional staffing. That even happens in public policy organizations. And it definitely happened when President Trump was elected. He spent 4 years getting undermined from inside the House by personnel who did not understand why the voters selected him in 2016 above and beyond the rest of that field, and why the general electorate ended up giving him the keys to the White House. And so they spent 4 years at best, slow walking his agenda, and at worst, actively undermining it. We think at American Moment that can never happen again. And so what we're trying to do is to find not a mass movement of young people, but a particular cadre of people who are interested in devoting their lives to helping solve and flesh out some of these issues, whether it's trade or immigration or supporting American families or restraining our foreign policy or what have you, and putting them in positions to be congressional staff, be staffers in public policy organizations, to lead behind the scenes in some of these very niche fights that end up having a lot of implications for what actually happens, has implications for whether or not that Georgia bill actually passes the Senate as well as the House, that actually, ends up mattering for whether or not we get the ball across the finish line on a lot of these issues. So we're trying to develop and identify and educate and credential that cadre and draw from, the real base of this country. One of the things that we believe in at American Moment is that you shouldn't need a college degree to be involved in this stuff. We don't believe in sort of the existing credentialing mechanisms that the right tends to have a lot of insecurity about. It's like if you have a Harvard or Yale degree and you show up in DC, it's very easy to get a job, even though the right ostensibly recognizes that those institutions are no longer fit to task. We don't have that insecurity. We're willing to find people from all sorts of backgrounds, giving them the support they need and helping them be part of leading this country in some of the behind the scenes ways that are really important.
Yeah, well, Saurabh, Sharma, thanks for the work that you're doing with the American Moment. Matt Peterson, for the work you do at the American Mind for many years at Claremont, also, I think, giving intellectual ammunition to a lot of folks in our movement. And to those of you in the audience, most importantly, for taking the time to watch and to listen and hopefully to hear some action steps, if you will, about how all of us can work together towards seizing the American moment. I will say, for my sake and on behalf of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, that we're optimistic because Texas is not just going to have a great legislative session. The policy side of this is important, but far more importantly, to I think the heart of the conversation today, Texans are realizing that now is our time. Now is a time for Americans of sound mind, Americans who maybe aren't yet thinking, voting the way that the three of us do, but recognizing that we really are at a fork in the road. And almost every single time in American history, we've chosen the right path because the right leaders emerge with the right ideas. And very importantly, the most important point from today, they have the political courage to stand athwart history and point to the right direction forward. That's the kind of courage that our leaders need. But if we're expecting them to show that courage has to start with us. So thanks for tuning in. Matt and Saurabh, thanks again for joining us. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of our hands as we seize this moment. Take care.
Thank you, Kevin.